Horror stands as one of the most popular genres in fiction. Whether in the form of a book, a movie, or a video game, people love a good scare. And when it comes to scary video games, over the course of the last 30 years, horror fans were blessed with some great titles such as the Silent Hill and Resident Evil series, Fatal Frame, Alone in the Dark, and many, many more. However, over the last couple of years, more specifically this decade, horror games have really taken a different turn. Titles like Amnesia: The Dark Descent and the original Slender inspired a whole generation of horror games where you're put in the shoes of an unarmed main character who goes around solving puzzles and collecting items while always being on the lookout for the unkillable big baddie. Now, don't get me wrong, Amnesia itself is a great game, and this specific subgenre of survival horror did produce some really good titles like Alien Isolation and the original Outlast. Even the original Slender is celebrated, if nothing else than for its sheer novelty at the time. But, just like their movie counterparts, most modern horror games rely on jump scares way too much, and this whole shtick of taking away the player's ability to defend themselves looks like nothing more than a cheap way of making the experience more tense and scary. For this reason, I would like to turn your attention over to Condemned: Criminal Origins, a first-person detective psychological horror developed by Monolith Productions and released in 2005 for the PC and Xbox 360. The story of Condemned goes like this. You're Ethan Thomas, a detective working for the FBI's Special Crimes Unit. The game takes place in the fictional Metro City, a city where everything is slowly going to complete shit. At the start of the game, you and your partner arrive at the murder scene of a young woman, the latest victim of a serial killer plaguing the city, simply known as the Matchmaker.
Sick bastard.
After a brief introduction to the detective aspect of the gameplay, on which there will be more word later, Ethan and his buddies realize that there is somebody else on the floor above them and move out to apprehend them. What follows is another tutorial-like section where you move throughout the building and get introduced to the basics of Condemned's combat system. You start off with your pistol and are able to dispatch foes easily from a distance.
Federal agent, come out peacefully or I will use force.
But soon enough, while turning the power back on, you get knocked down and lose the gun, forcing you to take a more direct approach. After wandering around the building some more, you get knocked out from behind by the killer, and almost immediately your cop buddies get killed and you're thrown out of the window. In the next scene, you are in your apartment, greeted by Malcolm Van Horn, a supposed friend of your father, who informs you that the police will be looking for you because your buddies were shot by your gun. Okay? Anyway, from this point on, the story turns into a manhunt for the Matchmaker and some other folks, but shh, those are spoilers, as Ethan makes his way through Metro City, visiting its most decrepit and decaying parts. The plot itself isn't anything groundbreaking. In fact, it suffers from some very obvious inconsistencies and blatant plot conveniences. For example, let's take the aforementioned murder of your colleagues. In the apartment, Ethan and Van Horn argue about what to do next, with Van Horn informing Ethan that they have already decided the truth, in reference to Ethan's superiors.
What? Tell them the truth? They have already decided the truth.
But why? Why wouldn't the police believe their agent and instead think that he was the one who killed the officers? The driving force of the entire game literally depends on whether Ethan believes a random stranger who somehow got into his house, telling him that the police has already decided that he is the guilty one. There are a couple of more similar instances throughout the game, but they somewhat cross over into spoiler territory, so this is where I'll stop. It might sound like I want to nitpick, but stuff like this is really hard to avoid and it does negatively impact the overall enjoyment of the game. Fortunately for us, Condemned's other aspects are a lot better. The first one I would like to talk about is the atmosphere and the physical setting. As mentioned before, the game, for the most part, takes place in Metro City, a place rapidly descending on a downward spiral towards total chaos. The violence in the city has increased tenfold, and all its residents seem to know is how to brutally murder each other. The enemies you'll face throughout the game, save for a few exceptions, all fall into this category of crazy homeless people and other vagrants who would like nothing more than to bash your skull in with a lead pipe. They have all lost their minds to the point where they have this downright feral thirst for violence, ignoring any harm and injuries coming their way. The various environments you find yourself in also greatly work in establishing Metro City as the rotten and decayed shithole it really is. Being a horror game, the locations you'll be visiting come off as stock standard for the genre. You got yourself a metro station complete with its underground, a rundown department store, abandoned schools and libraries, the whole package. However, all of these places are designed in such a masterful way that you never get that feeling of deja vu. As you move on from one location to the next, you truly and wholeheartedly get this feeling of descending further into madness itself. Ethan himself will suffer from horrific hallucinations from time to time. These are meant to symbolize his slow succumbing to the unknown force that plagues the Metro City. The atmosphere is also amplified by phenomenal sound design. Condemned's soundtrack consists of these dark and eerie industrial tones, which always keep you nervous and anxious, as you'll never know what lies around the next corner. The game also doesn't suffer from jumpscareitis. While there are occasional jump scares, they never come off as forced. There isn't that usual build-up to the jump scare, followed by that annoying sound. Rather, you experience them in a more organic way, as a natural product of the environment. In my personal opinion, the absolute apex of Condemned's atmosphere and horror is presented in the department store and school levels. People who have played the game will know exactly what I'm talking about. Furthermore, the game never outright reveals to you what the cause for the madness is. Is it of this world, or is it some cosmic force that is beyond our understanding? We do not know. Condemned perfectly understands the old saying that the greatest fear is fear of the unknown, and lets you, the player, fill out the gaps with your imagination. And though we do get some sort of closure and light shedding by the end of the game, it was still presented in a vague enough way, until the second game came along and pissed on everything. On the gameplay side of things, even though Condemned features quite a nice arsenal of firearms, it is not a first-person shooter. The game is primarily centered around melee combat and getting your hands dirty. There is a ton of melee weapons ranging from simple metal pipes to big shovels and fire axes. They all have different stats for damage, block, speed, and reach. Logically, bigger weapons like axes and sledgehammers will take a longer time to swing and hit, resulting in decreased speed and blocking capabilities, but their reach and damage output is massive. As for the actual combat, you attack with your left mouse button and block with the right mouse button. There is really only one attack style, but the direction in which you face your mouse will be the direction Ethan swings his weapon. The blocking mechanic is also great, as a successful block will knock back your enemies a little bit, giving you an opportunity to cave their skulls in. As an added bonus, if you bash an enemy long enough without killing them, they'll drop on their knees and allow you to execute a special finishing move. However, the combat isn't easy by any means. The enemy AI is really aggressive and will actively seek you out and attack you relentlessly. Sometimes they'll try to hide behind some sort of cover in order to surprise you, and this is once again where good sound design comes into place, as all enemies let off a very distinct sound and noise when they're around, thus giving out their location. Furthermore, if they do not have a weapon, they'll rip out a nearby conduit out of the wall, resulting in the loss of a light source in the room, which is a really nice and immersive touch. They can also feign their attacks by swinging their weapon without actually striking you, forcing you to block in panic and leave yourself open to an attack. As for the firearms, they can usually be found in hidden locations or in locked cabinets. This is for a good reason, because a single gun can change the outcome of an entire fight in seconds. There are no reloads or spare magazines, nor can you carry more than one weapon at a time. What ammo you have when you pick up a gun is what you get. Plus, you have to manually check how much ammo you have left, which is another nice touch that further adds to the immersion. Though the game can be inconsistent at times, so occasionally you'll see enemies reloading an already empty weapon. As a result, whenever you are in a fight, ranged enemies will always take priority, as guns really do kill quickly in this game.
Boom, dickhead.
Another very interesting mechanic, and the one you don't see very often in games anymore, is the ability to cause enemy infighting. As I mentioned before, the AI is extremely aggressive in its desire to turn you into minced meat, so it's very likely that they'll bump into and push away another hobo while they're running towards you, causing the same hobo to attack them instead. Infighting is always a fun mechanic in video games, and thematically it fits perfectly in Condemned, as it adds another layer to the insanity plaguing the city. And finally, you have the taser. The taser is your sidearm of sorts. You can use it to stun lock enemies or to cancel their attack, and later you even get an upgraded version which knocks down enemies, basically counting as an instant kill.
Oh, and I also left something there on the counter for you. Popular modification to the standard taser.
I have very mixed opinions of the taser. While I'm glad to have an extra means of defending myself, especially when I'm being gangbanged, the taser really comes off as an extremely cheap way of dealing with enemies, and can take a lot of the tension away. Especially since the fucking thing doesn't run out of ammo. It just has to recharge, but the recharge timer is also pretty low, around 8 seconds. It might as well not even be there. Honestly, I suggest using this thing sparingly, only when you absolutely need it. Otherwise, just stay away and pretend it's not even there. Trust me. Outside of combat, certain big weapons, like axes and sledgehammers, also function as utility items. You'll need them for opening certain doors and breaking into safes and cabinets containing vital supplies, and as you can't carry more than one weapon at a time, you'll need to strategize about swapping out, as you never know when you'll need a utility weapon to get access to that medical cabinet you so desperately need. Apart from committing hobo genocide, you will spend a certain amount of time doing detective work. Condemned is a detective game after all, even though that fact seems to get lost amidst all the carnage. You have a variety of tools at your disposal for analyzing the crime scene, collecting evidence and sending it to your partner Rosa, with whom you are almost constantly in contact with. Rosa also acts as an exposition dump and plot device from time to time, but we've already established that Condemned suffers in the story direction. Anyway, detective sections of the game are pretty interesting and serve as a great breather after an intense combat or horror sequence. Nearing the end of the game, there is a level set in an abandoned house, and you spend the entirety of the level searching the house for clues, while being almost constantly harassed by enemies, and becomes so tense and atmospheric since you have to lower down your weapon while using your equipment. I just wish they utilized it a bit more. It comes off as being underused. Moving on, visually, the game looks pretty damn good. Condemned uses the Lithtech Jupiter EX engine, the same engine used in Fear, another Monolith first-person horror game. The usage of lighting and shadows is superb throughout the board, The textures and models might look muddled at first glance, but this was done intentionally in order to further emphasize the brutality of the environment. There is a difference between having shit graphics and intentionally aiming for a muddy art style. I'm also a big fan of the various animations used for swinging weapons and telegraphing enemy attacks. I've already talked about the sound design and how awesome it is, however the same cannot be said for the voice acting. While it isn't bad per se, it definitely shows its cracks in certain places. I don't know if it was the budget constraints, but Condemned only features a handful of voice actors who had to play several different roles. There was also an obvious lack of direction when it comes to Ethan's character, because his voice actor is not bad at all, but he reacts so unnatural in certain situations. It's like they didn't tell the actor what emotions to invoke in particular scenes. However, apart from these small inconsistencies, the overall presentation is really good, and together with the gameplay, it blends beautifully to create this decrepit and rotten world. Unfortunately, Condemned is not a perfect game. I've already talked about some of its faults, like the taser being way too OP, and inconsistencies with the voice acting, and the overall story direction being a bit sloppy. Apart from that, I also feel they severely underused the scene analysis segments. The Steam port also suffers from bugs, both minor and major. For starters, there are these collectibles scattered throughout the game, but the achievements for them simply do not exist on Steam. There is also this major audio bug where you get entire chunks of the game without any background audio whatsoever, but this can be fixed. Apart from this, there is a hefty amount of smaller visual bugs that may or may not appear. They are not game breaking in any way, but it can be quite immersion breaking seeing enemies spawn weapons out of thin air. I guess Monolith either ran out of funds or were on a strict time schedule, because the majority of these simple bugs could have been easily spotted and polished. I've also noticed that Ethan sometimes gets stuck in the environment. It also doesn't help that sometimes your movement speed can be way too slow. Like, I get it, it's a horror game and you're supposed to move at a slower pace, and there is a sprint mechanic, and also Ethan is quite a big boy.
Damn, boy, he's thick, boy!
But sometimes I feel that the movement speed could have been ampled up just a little bit. Nevertheless, despite its shortcomings, Condemned Criminal Origins still remains a great example of a good Western horror game. It's tense, atmospheric, has good combat, and it doesn't overstay its welcome. I'd wholeheartedly recommend it to horror enthusiasts looking for a good scare this October.